Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. I'd like to welcome you to Fundraising Best Practices for Water Organizations. Today's premium webinar is offered to paid members of River Network as part of our Leadership Development Institute series. Just quickly, I'd like to remind you that today's session is the third in our current Effective Water Organization series, and really what I'm presenting to you today is an overview of best practices, fundraising best practices. If you want to dive deep into any of these topics, I encourage you to check out our Fundraising Essentials webinar series that we produced last winter, and links to those recordings or the previous webinars from this series on building strong boards and strategic planning are certainly, we'd be glad to email you those links to those recordings. So just reach out to one of our staff members and we can send you the links to those recordings. I did want to take a minute to thank you for your membership, your paid membership for River Network, and remind you of some of your premium member benefits. If you haven't checked out on the website, please do so. There's some great funding opportunities. We've got discounts on equipment, consultation, River Rally Conference. River Rally will be here before you know it next June. So do check out the website and make sure that you're taking advantage of all of your premium membership benefits. And if you have any questions, we've got a wonderful staff person in our Boulder office, Carly Schmidt, and she'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Wanted to, I guess, introduce myself at this point. My name is Caroline Bott, and I'm the Leadership Development Manager for River. I'm part of the Leadership Development team, and I'm based out of my home office on Virginia's Eastern Shore. And joining me today is my colleague, Paco Ayurvides. And Paco, I'll let you go ahead and jump on and introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning. I apologize, my camera turned on and I wasn't in the room yet, but I turned it off and I'm here to help out. I am based out of Ohio, and yeah, I am Caroline's counterpart.
Great, well, thank you, Paco. So Paco's gonna help launch our polls and handle our questions and provide some examples and content throughout our presentation today. Just briefly to go over our agenda, we're going to begin by talking about some important giving data to set the stage. I'm going to share with you the 10 best practices of a fundraising program that I've pulled together for you today. At the very end of today's presentation, I thought we'd be remiss if we didn't take advantage of the timing of today's webinar and talk about end-of-year giving. And then we'll certainly leave some time for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. I do have a couple stops throughout the presentation to provide questions or to answer questions. So please feel free to use your chat box to enter any questions that you have. If it's a point of clarification, Paco will ask me to pause and provide some clarity. And then we'll use the times allotted through the presentation to answer any questions that you have along the way. So with that, let's start with a couple of quick polls. Wanted to first find out who's in the room with us today. So Paco, I'll go ahead and let you launch our first poll, please. If you would, just indicate your role in your organization. I think you're only allowed to choose one here, so just choose your primary role in your organization if you would.
We got 69% of people voted so far.
Okay.
And 86%. 89%. Okay, I think we have 92% people voted.
Thanks, Paco. If you'll share those results with us, we'll get a sense of who's here today. Okay. And there is a slight delay. Let's see. And actually, Paco, will you read those off to me because I can't see those results?
No problem. The majority, a third, 35% are development staff, paid person. The next percentage is 26% executive directors, 21% are other, 15% board or development committee, and 3% a development volunteer.
Okay.
I'd be curious about that other part, and I can monitor the chat box if anybody wants to send more information.
Yeah, so if you would, just let us know what your other role is with your organization while Paco goes ahead and launches our second question. Why are you here today? Where are you on your fundraising journey continuum? So if you would just take a couple minutes and let us know, are you a well-seasoned fundraiser just looking for some new tips and ideas? Are you looking to grow your program, or are you just starting out?
Yeah, very good engagement, good response. We have about 78% people responding right now.
All right. Any folks telling us what their other roles are yet?
No, not yet. I'm going to close the poll. It's at 94%.
Great. So I can see these results now, and it looks like the majority of folks here have an established fundraising program, and they're looking to grow their program. So what that tells me is, some of the things that I'm going to share today, you're probably already doing and may just be some good reminders or reinforcing some of the good practices that you're doing. And hopefully you'll walk away with at least a couple more tips and ideas to take your fundraising program to the next level. Again, the folks, looks like about 9% are saying that they're just starting their fundraising journey. So those 9% of folks, I would really encourage you to take some time and reach out and request the links to those fundraising essential webinars, because I think, they'll give you a lot more detail, a deeper dive into some of the topics that we're just going to be going over today. So with that, let's move on to our first slide.
And just really quickly, Caroline, somebody asked where the handouts were located, and they're on the right-hand side, that menu bar. You should have a drop-down menu that says handouts.
Yeah, and we will certainly be providing them in a follow-up email to everybody as well, so don't stress out if you're unable to find them on the call today. We'll definitely follow up and provide them as well. As I said, I wanted to get started by just reviewing some giving data. If we're talking about fundraising, it's really important to understand where this money is coming from. So, I have two donut charts here. The first is from the Giving USA Foundation, which provides a wonderful philanthropic sector report on an annual basis. And so what they're reporting here are the giving numbers for calendar year 2017, and they're reporting on over $410 billion being given to charity. And just some other points from that report that I wanted to share. They report that total giving was up 5.2% across the nation, so that's great. And that individual giving was at an all-time high in 2017. The per capita giving by adults was $1,165, and the average household giving total was $2,271. So, how many of those dollars made their way to your organizations? Their report, if you're not familiar with it, you can look at the summary for free online. It's their full report. There is a fee associated with it, but their summary data is really informative. And if you're not familiar with it, they break fundraising into 10 sectors, and environmental organizations are grouped with animal pet organizations, and they make up about 3% of the total giving across the country. It should be no surprise that the two biggest sectors are education and religion. I also wanted to provide you with some maybe more like or similar data for your consideration. I think it's important to benchmark with similar groups. So the River Network data donut here represents data that we've collected over about two to 3 years from about 156 groups that reported data to us. And these are groups with which we have worked across the country. And what you'll see here is that a lot of our groups rely obviously on government grants. Individuals make up a smaller piece of the pie than it does when looking at giving across the country. And in case you're wondering, I did want to share as well, River Network's own numbers. Our annual report was just released last week, and 10% of individuals, or our giving is made up of about 10% individuals. 65% of our funding, in fact, comes from grants here at River Network, and the remaining 25% is earned income. So that's from membership dues, registrations, and fee for service and that type of thing. So just a little bit about giving in general, and wanted to spend just one more minute before we get into best practices talking about the giving pyramid. Maybe this is not the first time, probably not the first time you've seen this image. It's been discussed in fundraising circles for a number of years, and they're different variations of this concept. But the basic premise is that organizations receive more smaller gifts than larger gifts, and that it typically takes longer to solicit a larger gift. So, if you look at this chart, obviously across the bottom, the arrows represent, the base of the pyramid represents a greater number of donors, and so you have more one-time donors and people attending events than you do people who are participating in your annual campaign. It's an even smaller subset of your donors who are making major gifts to your organization. And what I'd like to say here is that, have you ever heard of the saying that 20% of your donations come from, 80% of your income comes from 20% of your donors. So that's your major givers, right? If you look at your giving history for your organization, and this is some interesting analysis to do, is that true for your organization? Some people say that ratio is even 90-10. So 90% of your income that's coming from individuals is coming from 10% of individuals. Again, this is just looking at individual giving here. And then, of course, the pinnacle of that your giving pyramid, the largest gifts that most organizations receive come in the form of a bequest or a will. And I'll tell you that not many of the groups we work with have a very robust planned giving campaign or program, but you don't have to have a program at all for someone to be able to leave a gift to your organization in their will. The last thing I want to mention about the pyramid is that you should be paying special attention to that mid-level donors. So really the annual giving block here and those donors, and think about what would it take for those donors to become major givers or major donors to your organization? How do you currently engage with them, and what would it take for them to make a larger gift to your organization? So, think about this and go back and look at your giving data and think about, does this really reflect your organization? Does this make sense? In fact, one thing I wanted to mention before I go off this slide is that some people are actually turning this concept on its head, and we're going to talk about that in just another minute. But this is kind of like the basis of fundraising 101. All right, so let's talk about best practices. Successful fundraising really goes hand in hand with building and deepening donor relationships. I like to say fundraising is truly, it's all about building relationships. So, remember that pyramid. What does it take to move somebody up that pyramid? So whether it's a board member, a staff member, reaching out, the goal is the same. It's to get a prospective donor from just being interested and aware of your organization to engage with your organization, become a volunteer. Actually, there's a volunteer pyramid as well that is very similar to that, the donor giving pyramid, and it looks at, your pinnacle are your board members, right? Because they've engaged the longest with your organization. But, think about how you're building relationships and how you're deepening a donor's engagement. You're actually trying to get them to invest long-term in your organization. So as you think about deepening those relationships and building those relationships, I wanted to mention a couple of things here. The first, and I use this saying a lot, is that fundraising is really an opportunity for your donors to invest in the change they want to see in the world. I didn't make this saying up. A lot of people use this saying, but I think it's really important to put it in front of you and have you think about that because it should change the way you think about your appeals with donors. It's not, what people aren't giving to you, they're actually giving through you. So, remember that people aren't giving to your organization because your organization has a specific need. They're giving to your organization because of the impact you're having on the community or the environment or whatever your mission is. So, think about appealing to them and allowing them this opportunity to invest in this change they want to see in the world. Remember, when we're talking about building relationships, that every interaction you have with a donor is an opportunity to deepen that relationship. So whether you're sending them a newsletter or you're creating and sending out, sharing a Facebook post, that's an opportunity for engagement. So, think of those touches, if you will, and you should have a certain number of touches before you actually ask a donor for a donation. And then the final thing I wanted to mention here, obviously, is that, if you want to raise money, you've got to ask for money. Rarely do individuals make a gift to an organization just because they think it's a great organization. Somebody has to actually ask them. So whether they're responding to a direct mail appeal, an e-appeal, or an in-person ask, somebody actually has to make that connection, have that relationship with that person, and make that connection. It rings true that in-person asks are always the most successful, way to solicit a gift. A little bit more about this relationship building. This is kind of the process that typically you would go through. This is the fundraising cycle or the donor cultivation cycle, and the steps here, and they're color-coded to match the phases of the circle here. You first have to identify an individual as a prospective donor for your organization, and then you work to cultivate that individual. So let's back up and talk about identification first. This is the opportunity for your board, for your staff, for your volunteers to think of individuals in your community who might have an affinity for the work of your organization. Is it folks at your church or your civic connections, at your school? Where do you spend money? Who would be interested in the work that you're doing, and can you introduce them to your organization? And then once that introduction has occurred, you start to cultivate the donor. And by cultivation, what we mean here is that the donor is learning about your organization. So this could be from your website, from attending events, from your newsletter. They're learning about your organization, and more importantly, you're learning about the donor and maybe what their interests are. You continue in this cultivation phase until you get to the point where you feel like the donor is ready to make a gift. And again, more than likely, this is going to initially be a response to annual fund mailing. We're not talking major donors at this point, but there is the solicitation phase. And then what happens next is what I think is truly the most important part of this process, and that's the stewardship phase. And this is where you begin to thank your donors, and you continue to foster these good relations and try to develop a deeper engagement with them. The real purpose of this phase is to keep the donors engaged in this donating cycle and to encourage them to make repeat gifts and hopefully increasing amounts of gifts over time. And the other thing to say about this image here is typically the links of the arrows indicate how much time you should be spending in each of these phases. So, most of your time is truly spent either cultivating or stewarding and engaging donors. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the giving pyramid that some folks are actually trying to or have suggested that we flip that pyramid on its head. In fact, I came across this image yesterday and wanted to include it in the presentation today because I really like what's going on here and the message it's conveying. I really see this as representing the shift from transactional thinking to transformational thinking when you think about donor relationships. And the same steps of the donor cycle, the fundraising cycle, and the giving pyramid are going on here. But I just, again, like the way this is really represented. So let's walk through this for a second. The first piece is engagement, right? So you see the group of folks there on the left-hand side, and they're on the top of the building, and there's a diving board. That's the diving board of engagement, right? What are you doing? How are you reaching out to people in your community to engage them, to interest and identify and interest them in your organization? Once that donor crosses, that engagement diving board and jumps into your funnel, right, they become participants, whether they're helping with a stream cleanup or volunteering stuffing envelopes in your office, or hopefully making a donation to to your organization, they're participating. They're getting to know your organization. Again, it's that cultivation. They're getting to know you. You're getting to know them. The first gift you see in the middle of this pool here, there's a little, a little splash indicating that somebody has dove under the water, right? They've made that first gift. So here we go. Think back to the fundraising cycle. We've cultivated, we've solicited. Okay, they've made the gift. Here's where stewardship kicks in, right? This is the place that is ultimately going to determine the likelihood and time it takes for a donor to make it to the what they call here the loyal donor layer. In our other graphic, that's really indicative of the annual giving level. So, what is it going to take that first-time donor and make them a loyal supporter of your organization? And I like this analogy. In the retail world, they actually say that 3 is the magic number. I don't know if you've heard this before, but if somebody makes 3 purchases, a business considers them a loyal customer. So what if we were to think about donors in that same regard? So, how do you identify an annual giver? How do you identify a loyal donor? Are we retaining them as a donor? So I think that's kind of a nice threshold to kind of say, okay, if somebody's made 3 gifts to our organization, they must, really be interested in us and believe in us. They're trusting us. They've continued their engagement. So we're going to call them a loyal donor. And this layer is the tricky layer because this is where a lot of your donors are going to remain for the longest time, right? This is those annual givers. What does it take to make them a major donor, to get them to make a major gift? During this time, again, the more personalized you can be with your donors, the quicker you're going to be able to identify if they have the potential to be a major donor for your organization. So the more personalized you can be in your communications. This group, they like to have multi-channel approaches to solicitation and stewardship. They like to be reminded of the impacts of their gifts. So this is, again, where you're asking yourself, what can I do to take that donor and make them a major donor? And then for the group of folks that you're able to continue down the funnel and bring them to the major gift level, this is where it really gets fun. This is where the relationship building really starts to pay off. And here it's all about the authenticity of your organization, right? So the most influential part of this is, your organization and how you're treating fiscal transparency, how you're demonstrating the impact of their gift. Again, it's all about the donor and, the change they want to see in the world. So how are you demonstrating that impact to them? And how are you celebrating and thanking them? This is really, where the proof is in the pudding, right? So how are you engaging with those major donors? And if you can, how are you leveraging them among their peers? So this is a great opportunity to start thinking about capturing testimonials of why your major donors give to your organization and help build profiles on these individuals so you can share that with your peers and hopefully bring others up or down the funnel into this major giver level. And then finally, again, it's kind of the pinnacle here of this funnel, which not everybody gets there, but people believe that it's a lifetime of major gifts that ultimately lead to that, that pinnacle of philanthropy, the planned gift at the bottom of the funnel. Paco, how are we doing on questions? Everything good there?
Nobody's posting questions and nobody's writing any chat right now, but feel free to do so. I'm monitoring, and I'm actually doing some internal questions, but other than that, you're good.
Great, thank you. All right, moving on to best practice number 2. A case for support. I believe that every nonprofit organization needs to have a case for support. Sometimes this is called your case statement, but basically it's just a compelling story for why you exist, what you do, and it's a call to action and an invitation, again, for donors to, have that impact that they want to have. So, and it's really the most important tool in your organization's fundraising toolbox. And I say that because it's the primary resource that's guiding your donor communications. So if written well, you can basically use your case for support and adapt it for grant proposals, your major gift visits, general solicitations, volunteer recruitment. And additionally, I think it's a really, writing the case for support is, going through that process is really a good idea because it helps build consensus and provides focus for your board and your staff so that everybody is using the same language and on the same page about what our funding priorities are for this year and what our programs are. So it's really just a really invaluable piece of your fundraising program. Some of the questions that you want to answer in your case for support is, what's your call to action? Why do you need funding this year? Excuse me, and what are you raising money for this year? What are your goals? It's really helpful to break it down by program. And two important questions to answer is, what happens if you don't make your goal this year? What will the impact on the environment be, or how will people be affected? And an even better question to answer and more fun question to answer is, what if you got twice as much money as you had set out to raise? What would you do, or what could you do then? So think about those questions. I've got the elements up here on the slide, but I did want to mention some tips for writing your case for support. Really, your vision and your mission need to be very clear. You should be showing examples of your results and telling donors, why you need their funding and clearly defining what's in it for them.
Caroline?
Yeah.
One question here come in. How has 2018 changes in tax giving laws impacting the future?
Can you say that one more time, or actually I can even pull it up too. How has
2018 changes in tax giving laws impacting the future?
How are the tax laws? I think I don't know if Patty, you have some thoughts on that. My response would be that how has 2018 changes in tax giving laws impacted? I'm assuming when you say the future, you're asking about how it's changing giving this year. And I think it's a little early to say because folks will be doing their taxes in the coming year. But I recently heard a presentation, and the truth is that the tax incentive is really not the highest motivator for people who are making gifts and making donations. So I think that that's an important thing to remember. While it's a nice benefit, it's not really what's motivating people. The tax benefit is not what's motivating people to make these gifts. So we can talk about that more at the end.
I agree, Caroline. Most of the time, people give not so much because of tax incentive. The tax incentive definitely is a perk, but I don't think it's going to have such a big impact on major donors because they're doing it for maybe other reasons. There's two responses more there. This is Deanna says too early to tell. This end of year giving season will tell us more, and likely the impact the really high gifts to hospitals, schools.
Exactly. And I think there'll be a lot to say about this in the coming year, and it's something I'm definitely interested in seeing and tracking for sure. The last thing I wanted to mention about the case for support is this is something that you need to be reviewing and revising annually. So we talked about moving people around the fundraising cycle and up the pyramid and down the funnel. So how do you do that? And the answer is you have to have a plan, right? Simply put, a fundraising plan helps you organize all of your fundraising activities over a certain period of time, and usually it's on an annual basis. And they generally include goals and strategies and detail who's responsible for those and what they're going to be and when you're going to do them and what the costs are. Again, the good thing about, and we'll talk a little bit more about fundraising plans in the next couple of slides, but the really good thing about them, again, is that they really help bring your staff and your board together so that you all understand clearly what your fundraising goals are and how, what your plan is to achieve those goals. Fundraising planning really should be part of your larger planning continuum, right? You should have a strategic plan, and from there you should be, developing your annual work plans and your annual budget. And from there, a lot of people, develop their fundraising plan along with their budget, but it really should be a standalone separate document. And we've got a template that we use with organizations, which you'll see here in a minute, and it might make it a little more clear if it's something that you've not actually gone through the process before to develop. Plans are typically developed by staff with input from a board development committee. I recommend that they actually be approved by the board. And you should be reviewing the plan regularly, at least on a quarterly basis, to measure, your activities and your goals, and to find out where you're on target, where you're ahead of target, and also importantly, where you're off target, and if you can change some things along the way. So let's take a quick look at best practice 4, which again deals directly with your fundraising plan. The image here on the bottom, which I know is really small and hard to see, but this is an example of a fundraising template that we use with the groups with which we work. And as you can see, hopefully, the important thing here is that it's pretty detailed, right? And we talk about you want to develop SMART goals and strategies. So, be as specific as you can when developing your goals for your plan so that you can measure your plan, and be specific in terms of who's responsible for these different pieces. You'll notice, the board and staff both have roles to play, and we'll talk about roles and responsibilities in a minute. Your fundraising plan should also include things like a list of prospects. So say, for instance, you want to raise $50,000 in major gifts. Whom are you planning to ask for that money? You need to have some people already in your queue that have what I like to call the ABCs of major gifts, right? They have the ability to give, they have the belief in your organization, and they have a connection to your organization. So again, we're going back to that relationship building. There may be a very generous individual in your community who gives a lot of money to the SPCA, but they may have no interest in giving to a water organization. Or they may have no connection to your organization. So, be realistic. That's the attainable here and the SMART goals. Be realistic in setting your goals. And the final thing about fundraising plans that I want to mention is the importance of the timeline. You'll see we have a timing column here, but even just developing a calendar, by month, what are the fundraising activities that your organization is going to do? And then, use that as a checkpoint to make sure you're on task. Wanted to just dive a little deep here in talking about fundraising strategies, because this is the real meat of a fundraising plan. Typically, you want to have a balance. You're gonna need to use multiple strategies to meet your goals, right? And so you want to have a balance of strategies, and we're going to talk in a minute about the criteria you might use to choose your strategies. But basically, this is just an example, but this chart here shows how different strategies meet different needs. So for example, if you're a startup organization, then board requests are probably one of the very first strategies you want to employ in your fundraising plan. And I would argue every organization that has a board of directors should have a board campaign. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Again, just continuing on with some more strategies here, you can see, again, what purposes they could potentially fill in your organization. The idea here is that, over time, your strategies are going to change and should change. You're probably going to add some strategies to your fundraising plan, a major donor program or sustained giving, other more sophisticated activities. But again, the important takeaway is that you should be using multiple strategies to meet your organization's needs. So let's talk a little bit about how you would choose a strategy. When deciding on which strategies are best for your organization, it's helpful to ask some questions. First of all, does the strategy fit with the mission of our organization? Do we have the resources, the time, the money, and the people to carry it out? Does the strategy represent a stable and repeatable source of income? Does the strategy contribute to growing our core operating budget? Is this strategy cost effective? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But a good rule of thumb here is that if you can identify strategies that bring in at least twice what they cost, and I guess let me pause and just reiterate how important it is to try to determine the cost of your fundraising strategies in your plan, and we'll talk about plan evaluation at the end and your return on investment. But you know, it's only a piece of the pie if you're talking about your strategies and your income. You need to talk about the cost, the true cost of fundraising as well when doing this planning work. You know, one other really good question to ask is, will this strategy target the constituencies, you know, will target our constituencies? Will our donors respond to this particular strategy? You should also consider, again, return on investment. So here in general, the idea is that you want to have strategies that have low resource needs. So in the bottom of this grid here is staff time and direct expense that don't take a lot of staff time, that don't cost a lot, but that have a high net. Yeah, that's great. You know, what strategies, what would those look like? So for example, special events typically are a high resource, low net strategy. High resource in that they take a lot of time, they cost money in general. Fundraising events, you raise about 50 cents on every dollar. Or excuse me, you raise 50, it costs you 50 cents for every dollar that you make, as opposed to major donor campaigns, when the return on those is, you know, it costs you about 10 cents for every dollar that you make. In general, these are just standard, you know, standard fundraising across the country. So that's not to say that there's not a place for special events in your organization. You know, they certainly may be providing some needed visibility and bringing in more donors. You know, they could be a fundraising event. But you really need to have a good balance, and you need to be critical when thinking about these different strategies, because, you know, ideally you really would like to, you know, get the most bang for your buck here.
Caroline, I agree on that last point you said, because a lot of people refer to them as fundraisers, but sometimes they complement, because they help that pool on the pyramid you were talking about remain engaged, the personal touch, and then eventually they can become major donors or something. So we're not saying, correct me if I'm wrong, we're not saying don't do events. Just realize that events are not going to be your primary revenue maker. They're going to be a tool to get to your primary revenue makers.
Most likely, definitely. There are some organizations that are, you know, have a really well-established event and raise literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. But those organizations are few and far between. It seems like most organizations with which I've worked, you know, raise on average, you know, $30,000 to, you know, $40,000 for a special event. And if you think about the time spent in planning the event, organizing the event, you know, all the logistical headaches that go along with that, if you're raising $30,000, wouldn't it be great if you could tap $5,000 donors or whatever it is? You know, you can see how the cost benefit plays out when you start comparing it to other fundraising strategies. But no, one of the best, you know, in addition to being fundraising events, you know, special events are a great time to celebrate the work of your organization, and that's such an important piece of you know, supporting an organization is celebrating the people who support your organization, the donors, celebrating the great work you're doing. So there's definitely room for all these strategies out there, but just be aware of, you know, the true costs and what it takes and why you're doing them. And you may, you know, right now you may have 2 or 3 events in a year, and you may decide that you want to, you know, focus in on just one, and then spend more time focusing on building your donor base. So, but thank you for that, Paco. We're about halfway through here. We're up to best practice number 5, and we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to dive a little more deeply and talk about the money, the type of money we're raising. So here what I'm really talking about, there's 2 types of funds in my mind, unrestricted dollars and those with temporary or permanent restrictions. And we're not going to really get into, we're not going to get into permanent restrictions at this point. Those would be contributions made to an endowment, or things like that. But we're talking about more temporary restrictions. So starting first with the unrestricted dollars, people call these the most valuable dollars you can raise because, you know, they're basically the most flexible. You can use all of this money that comes in. Unrestricted funds typically go towards general operating support. So, this is your salaries, your admin, your fundraising costs, or to any project or capital need that you have. And they help typically fill gaps in your budget to support your mission. This money typically comes from members via, your annual campaign, so direct mailing or email solicitations. And a lot of times what you'll see is on a donation return card or something, you'll see an organization will have a checkbox where somebody can check, I'd like my money to go to the organization's greatest needs, right? So these are unrestricted dollars. Great to have, a lot of those coming in to the organization. But if you're soliciting gifts for a special project, then those gifts would be considered temporarily restricted. So here is where the donor is either designating that they want their gift to go to a particular project or purpose. And so those gifts, those donations can only be used for that stated purpose. So, here is an example where a donor might make a contribution for the purchase of water quality monitoring equipment. You've got to use that money as the donor designated. The most common form, that obviously groups with which we work see restricted or temporarily restricted dollars is with grants, right? Because, there's some specific program requirements based on this funding, and so, the restrictions are there. Two things I'd like to highlight here. First is really, you need to be clear when you're soliciting gifts, whether or not you're asking donors to make an unrestricted gift to your organization, or if you're actually soliciting them for a specific purpose. And two, it's important to ensure, as my little image here shows, you really want to have a balance of unrestricted and restricted dollars. Obviously, it would be great if all dollars came in were unrestricted, but the reality is many organizations rely heavily, and I would say too heavily, on these temporarily restricted dollars, and then that can lead to problems, when there are insufficient unrestricted dollars coming in to support the general operations of the organization. So I would encourage you, if you don't know what your current ratio is, to find out and use that information, to help think about what fundraising strategies and what your fundraising goals are. A rule of thumb, just to kind of give you, a suggestion, a rule of thumb would be that no more than 40% of your income should come from one funding source. So here in the Mid-Atlantic and the Chesapeake, we've got a funder that is sunsetting right now, and so any organization that relied, heavily on that one particular organization is now having to, find an additional funder to keep their doors open, or a lot of times funders will, change their priorities over time. So you don't want to be put in a situation where you're relying on, one particular funder who may not be there in the future. So again, just points to the need to diversify, your funding strategies and sources. Along those lines, the last thing I think we have here before we're going to stop for some questions is predictability versus flexibility. So again, when looking at funding sources, it's really good to kind of weigh the predictability of funding versus the flexibility of funding and the money that you're receiving. So, the chart here is really for illustrative purposes, but you can get the point that government grants and foundation grants are highly competitive. So the predictability of funding is pretty low, and typically they come, specific to they come for a specific programmatic use, right? So here is a grant for X. So they don't have a lot of predictability, and they are highly restricted, as opposed to go to the top end of this chart, those membership renewals, right? And those are those unrestricted dollars. People are giving you an annual gift, so there's a higher level of predictability that income is coming in. And in most cases, those dollars are unrestricted. So again, think about restricted versus unrestricted, the predictability versus flexibility here when you're looking at your strategies and putting all these things together for your fundraising plan. So again, I was going to pause here for a minute or two if we had to get caught up in any questions before knocking out our last 5 best practices. Do we have any,
No questions. No questions on the question box. No comments on the chat box.
Okay.
But you're doing well. It is a lot of material, so I'll let it sink in for folks. I would suggest.
For sure. And again, pop questions in there at any point in time, and we should have at least a good 15 minutes or more at the end of today's call to work through any questions you have. Okay, moving on to roles and responsibilities. I like using this image because I think it illustrates well the importance of working together to achieve something, and that's truly the case when it comes to fundraising planning. If you have more members on your team and they all have specific roles and responsibilities, then generally your fundraising program is going to be more successful. So let's talk first about staff roles and responsibilities. Again, the obvious thing here is that staff is bringing, the fundraising expertise. And they're providing the overall coordination for the fundraising program. An important role, though, that staff have, in my opinion, is to provide the information and support to help board members and volunteers succeed in fundraising. So what does that look like and what does that mean? It's giving board members some resources on fundraising training and helping them understand how important their role is and recognizing the importance of their role. A little bit more about staff here too. I don't know the staffing of all the organizations on the call here today. Obviously, it's going to vary greatly, but regardless of your staffing, if you have a director of development, if you have an executive director or board chair, it's truly your executive director who's the face of your organization when it comes to fundraising. So they're the people that should be out meeting with prospective donors and your major donors and helping to solicit donations. Even if there is a director of development, the executive director really plays kind of that key face of fundraising for most organizations. If there is a director of development in your organization, then typically that person is kind of the orchestra conductor, if you will. Keeping all the strategies in tune, helping the board members manage their prospects and coordinating meetings and doing all of the gift acknowledgement and all of those really important behind the scene pieces of managing your fundraising program. If you're an organization that doesn't have any staff, then what? Then, the responsibilities fall to the board. And so, again, I think it's really important when you're developing your fundraising plan to identify who's going to be responsible for which pieces of your plan. So let's talk a little bit more about board roles and what those look like.
Caroline,
yeah.
Before you go into board roles, there was a question back to the new tax laws, if you don't mind. How do you think the new tax structure affects individual giving and membership contributions? I think we talked about it a little bit.
Specific to membership contributions? I don't know that it does. At least I don't have any research that shows that it's impacting it yet. If the question is specific to membership organizations and tax laws, that's not something I'd have to look that up and research that a little bit, but I don't think it impacts membership dues. When we talk about membership, I guess we need to clarify if we're talking about a membership organization or a member organization that requires annual dues as opposed to an organization that has a self-perpetuating board of directors. So I guess I'd need a little clarification, but I don't know that I know the answer to that at this point either.
Okay. And then when you were talking about the cultivation cycle and all that, I think this came back from, could you talk directly about making the ask? What language you use?
Yeah, so I don't know that we'll get into that today, but the person that asked that question, I will be glad. We've got a couple resources, including an entire hour-long webinar on making the ask, and so I'd be happy to share those resources because we do have some tips for doing that and how you go about doing that. That's not something we're actually going to get too much into today. If we have some time at the end of the call, I'd be glad to talk about that a little more, though.
Thank you. Thank you. And then my strength is board roles. I mentioned to Caroline. So I will let her talk about the responsibilities of board members in terms of fundraising, but it actually segues to the webinar that I will be giving in January on volunteerism and advanced volunteers, which are these board members. So some of these concepts will be repeated, or they will show some similarities. But go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Paco. Hands down, I would say that board engagement is, a best practice. In my mind, fundraising is a core responsibility of board members. But a lot of times board members are unaware of these responsibilities, or they lack the skills and confidence. So again, remember, I think it's partially on the shoulders of staff to help train the board and show them how they can engage in the fundraising process. In my mind, very few board members, when I say fundraising, most board members think, I don't want to ask people for money. But, asking for money is honestly a very small part of fundraising. That cultivation and the stewardship, there's no ask involved in that. And that's really where board members can shine when it comes to fundraising. Couple of, things that I think are non-negotiable. I encourage all organizations to strive for 100% participation in board giving. And, I do get some pushback at times on this because, board members say, well, I'm already giving up my time. But, quite honestly, dollars and service are not interchangeable. And, the response to that is if the people who are closest to your organization don't support it, then, why should anybody else? And in fact, a lot of funders will ask an organization, what percentage of board support they have in terms of fundraising. So it's really important. I think the most important reason a board member should give is because, it gives them confidence to talk about their commitment to the organization. So, it changes the conversation from will you give to join me in giving and supporting this organization because of the great work we're doing. It's really important for your board to establish some goals and policies regarding fundraising that we'll talk about a little bit later. As I said, I really think board members shine in their roles and opportunities to help identify, cultivate, and steward donors. Again, where appropriate, they can assist with solicitations, but that's certainly not their primary goal in this process. And one of their, again, most important things is that they're ensuring that the fundraising program has the adequate resources and support it needs. So, it does cost money to fundraise, and you need to be realistic about that, and you need to plan for that. I did want to share quickly here, and I'll send out these resources afterwards, but one easy way to help board members engage is to create an expectations document. And I encourage groups, again, to use these on an annual basis with board members. And it basically says, here are the types of ways you can get involved in fundraising. So let me know which of these, you're able to help us with. And also, what is going to be your pledge this year, your financial pledge to the organization. I think this is really, really important. And with regard, actually, I should pause and say, with regard to board fundraising, board campaigns, this is done on a peer-to-peer level. This should be led by your board chair. Your executive director or your director of development should not be asking board members for gifts. This should come as a peer ask and should be managed by the board chair, certainly with the support of the staff. A quick word about appropriate use of peer pressure, because I've had groups have asked me this question before. Should I be announcing it board members? Well, Sue gave this month, and here's the list of people who haven't given. It's important to recognize board members, I think, when they make a major gift to your organization or when they renew their membership or donate to a campaign. So I think it is fair to say that, 50% of our board has given, by this particular date. It isn't that great, and we want to thank them. And certainly, if they're bringing in other dollars, other major donors, it's it's appropriate to talk about that at the board member level as well. So what I'm saying is a little bit of peer pressure doesn't help, doesn't hurt. So be judicious in what you're sharing, but I think there's an appropriate level that of board pressure that can help if there are some people who are hesitant to give as board members. And then finally, about these roles and responsibilities, some organizations are fortunate enough to have development committees. And the thing I would say about development committees here is that, typically they should be chaired by a board member, but the members of the committee could be volunteers of the organization. And in fact, I would argue that it's a great way to test drive a board member is to see if they're interested in volunteering on the development committee and getting involved, whether it's in a special event or stuffing envelopes or getting more involved in the fundraising process program for the organization. Some of their main roles, certainly they can help develop the fundraising plan. Identifying prospects, again, is something the board should be doing and the development committee can be doing. And again, participating in cultivation activities is a great role for people who are on your development committee. One final word about these roles and responsibilities. It's important to recognize that, a lot of this work is shared across different constituencies, right? So the board and the staff and the volunteers, and again, this is just kind of an example, but I would encourage you to think about your fundraising tasks for your organization and who should be the lead for these tasks and who should be the support for these tasks, and identify those and call those out. Because when you go through this process, what you may find is that, you've got some people in a leadership role that maybe should be in a support role or vice versa. But know that a lot of these fundraising tasks and responsibilities truly are shared across the organization or your organization. All right, best practice number 7. Again, this is one thing that I think is non-negotiable because I truly think that, excuse me, my throat's dry here, hold on. I truly think that having a database can be transformational for your development program. So if you don't have one, you should get one and basically get your data working for you. And by that, what I mean is that there's so much information that can be mined out of your database. For instance, can you segment your donors? How are you identifying your major donors? I go back to one of our earlier slides when I was talking about that 80-20. So who are those top 20% of your donors? Can you tell me that today? If we're having a conversation on the phone, I said, hey, tell me who your top 20 donors, 20% of your donors are. Could you pull that information out? Great use to segment your database to help with special appeals, to build campaigns, to identify major donor prospects, help keep you on track in terms of your cultivation and your stewardship interactions. So there's lots of great uses for databases. We get a lot of people actually call us and say, hey, what would you recommend? And I think it's very specific to your particular organization. What can you afford? What are your needs? What I have listed here, you'll notice if you've been in fundraising for a while, names like Razor's Edge aren't on this list because that's kind of for the big dogs. This list here I like because it was developed by the Third Space Studio, in their benchmark project, and they were specifically looking at organizations with budgets under $2 million. Benchmarking a little more closely with many of the water organizations that we work with. And so this is the top 9 databases that the respondents to their survey reported, and the question was asked, how much do you like your database? And the scale was 0 to 5. So with 5 being the highest rating. So these are just, again, you can kind of see what groups out there are using across the country. Again, if you don't have a database, I would encourage you to speak to peer organizations, find out what they're using, what they like about their system, what they don't like about their system. 2 more things about databases. Another good resource for you if you're not, if you don't already have a TechSoup account, I would definitely encourage you to check out TechSoup, the website, because they have great deep discounts on software and hardware for nonprofit organizations. In fact, when I led a watershed organization years ago, I got my first database from them. It was like a no-cost database, but it met our needs fine. But they have, some great resources there. And the final thing I wanted to say about databases is that it's one thing to have a database, but it's really important how you use your database. So I really encourage groups to take the time to create a manual on how gifts should be entered in your database so that there's consistency when it comes time to, analyze your database and do some of that data mining. So, basically the saying is good data in, good data out. Let's see, best practice number 8. We're in the home stretch now. So it's time to talk about evaluating your fundraising efforts.
Caroline,
yeah.
Somebody had asked what the numbers meant next to the vendors, and I responded it's the average rating out of a maximum of 5. But
Yeah.
somebody then asked to please repeat the source of that information.
So going back here, the Third Space Studio did a benchmark study. You can find them online. That's where this particular data comes. But if the source that they were looking for was TechSoup, that I mentioned, that was TECHSOUP is a website. And yeah, if you don't have a TechSoup website, definitely check them out, or account, definitely check them out. It doesn't cost anything to join TechSoup, and they've got a lot of great resources.
And then we have another question. Do you know of CRM systems that have an event management component? We would like to find one that other groups love that can combine both database basics and reporting while allow us to peer-to-peer fundraise.
I am hesitant to make any specific database recommendations, but I do have a really good resource, a report, in fact, that came out earlier this summer, and I'd like to share that with the group, and in particular the person asking the question, because I think it may have some of the information they're looking for. It takes a much broader look at databases and looks at a lot more functionality. So I would definitely send that resource. I can definitely send that resource on, and hopefully there would be some good possibilities there. But again, the thing I would caution is having purchased and migrated a number of databases throughout my nonprofit career. The companies are obviously trying to sell you their product, and that's why I say it's really important to talk to your peers, not just the people that they use as references, because obviously the people they use as references are having a good experience with the database. So I think it's real important to talk with some end users that you trust to make sure that it's going to meet your needs. Because again, if you're looking for a more sophisticated database, what I would say is that that's great. If you're going to invest in that type of thing, then it's important to invest in the training that goes along with that to make sure that you're getting certainly your investment out of it. So
and you have a few good questions here. It would be fantastic if you could share those resources with the entire group. On a please note there. And then one more, is there a cost estimate for the 9 donor software or DODOR software?
A cost estimate for what is that? I'm sorry?
It's typed 9 DODOR software. Maybe it was a type of donor software. This question came from Sandy Bin. Is there a cost estimate?
I think, honestly, the report that I'm going to share, I'm pretty sure it actually has the basic cost for those. So I'm pretty sure that information is there. I don't have that on that slide now, and I don't know that the benchmark report has that, but I think this other report that I came across this year has some basic costs. Obviously, if you get the different modules, if you want the event module, it's going to cost you more, and if you want wealth screening, it's going to cost you more, and all those different things. But I think that report does have some of the costs associated with it. So, okay.
Yep.
Let's move on to best practice number 8. As I said, we're in the home stretch here, and we're going to start talking about evaluating your fundraising efforts. And I've already talked about how important it is to, when developing your fundraising plan to set some goals that are measurable. So I really encourage you throughout the year, probably on a quarterly basis, to do a check-in with your plan. Are you meeting, like in the bottom here, your membership goals, right? So at the end of Q2, our goal, in 2018 was 40 new members, and we only have 19. Are we on track? Does that feel right? Do we need to step up some of our efforts? It's really important to kind of do these check-ins throughout the year so you don't get to the end of the year and realize you totally missed your mark, in one area. And again, if you did a good job writing your plan, you should have some pretty easy things to measure along the way. This is, here are, I would say that dashboards are a great tool to help visualize your fundraising plan progress. Some database software programs, as I mentioned, come with built-in dashboards, and you can easily create those. Or you can easily create those, of course, using Excel or even like simple tables here, where you're just, aggregating the data yourself and providing it in a table that you share with your development committee and board. Let's see. So I think, let's move on to the key. The second part of this evaluation piece is, in addition to checking in on your goals throughout the year, it's really important to do that year-over-year check-in. And so, again, there's lots of information out on the website or on the internet about key performance indicators for fundraising programs. But here are some of the ones that I think are pretty helpful. And I'll breeze through these, but again, I think we've got a handout that I'll share with you after the session. You can start measuring some of these key performance indicators for yourself. I've broken them down here into two different categories, fundraising metrics, obviously, and donor retention. So let's talk a minute or two about these fundraising metrics. So gifts secured and donation growth. Here, what you're measuring year over year is how many gifts your organization received over a certain period of time, typically a year, and was there an increase or decrease in the number of gifts? Average gift size, again, increase or decrease over that year. If you're doing any type of campaign, capital campaign where you've got pledges, what's your pledge fulfillment percentage? How many of your pledges have you realized? How many of your pledge gifts have come in? Your fundraising return on investment. This is the hard one to calculate, but so important. How much money have you raised compared to how much money you spent on fundraising over the course of the year? So really important to show that number. And again, might result in you tweaking your strategies in the coming year to try to increase, obviously, the money coming in, your return on investment. Online gift percentages is an interesting one to take a look at. I will tell you that, the direct mail appeal is not dead. While there does seem to be, an increase and a lot of interest surrounded around online giving, it's important to put that into perspective for your organization. So take a look at what percentage of your gifts actually come in online. And you'll know whether or not you need to focus in that area or not. Some donor retention metrics, again, just to quickly breeze through these. Donor retention rate, really important, the percentage of donors who have given more than once. But more importantly, that donor growth year over year. So how many donors, has your donor base overall grown or shrunk over the course of the year? Recurring gift percentages, what portion of your gifts actually are recurring gifts from previous donors? Giving capacity is a little more difficult because this involves looking and doing some wealth screening to determine whether or not, your donors are giving at the highest level that they could to your organization. Conversion rate is really important to look at when trying to evaluate your fundraising strategies. This is looking at the percentage of donors who respond to a specific campaign, appeal, or call to action. So if you send out a direct mail letter, how many donations are coming in as a result of that appeal or that ask? And if that's something you'd like to talk about, again, at the end of the session, I can give you some suggestions on how you might do that. But that's a really important thing. And the outreach, the number of times you contacted your donors, those are those important touches along the way. All right, policies and procedures, keeping us moving because of time here. We've already talked about board expectation, board development expectations. Again, those would be something that you would have your board members sign on an annual basis that talks about their engagement and involvement in your fundraising program. We have examples of development committee roles and responsibilities. Again, it's almost like a job description for your development committee members. Really important is a gift acceptance policy. This is something that a lot of groups don't realize that they need until it's too late. And by that, I mean, sometimes it's hard to say no thank you to a donor, but sometimes that's the more prudent path, right? There are some kinds of gifts that your nonprofit, your organization simply shouldn't or can't accept. It might be that, it results in more of a hassle or expense than it really benefits your organization. Or more importantly, it could run counter to your organization's values. This is the really tricky one. When you've got a board member who wants you to accept a donation from a corporation in your community who's been identified as a leading polluter of your local stream, and you've got a $10,000 check in hand, what are you going to do? And it can really lead to some ugly conversations and ugly disagreements and really tear apart an organization or tear apart a board. So by having a gift acceptance policy in place that's adopted and approved by the board can help provide some guidance and hopefully avoid some of these types of conversations and experiences. And also the IRS, in fact, actually considers this a best practice of an organization. The last two here, gift processing procedures, really important. This goes back to kind of the database management and how are you entering gifts into your database. What information are you recording? How are gifts of stocks processed? This type of thing. And then the gift acknowledgement procedures, I really like this one because this is where you start to look at how you're cultivating your donors. So, low-hanging fruit is, you get a gift and your policy is that gift needs to be acknowledged within 7 days. I would say kind of that's the benchmark you should hit. All gifts should be acknowledged within 7 days. But let's talk about, okay, all gifts of $100 or less get our standard thank you letter that's signed by our executive director. Great. How about gifts of $250 or more? Well, maybe any gift of that amount triggers a call from our executive director just to thank them for the gift, or a handwritten note from your board chair. This is where you can start identifying some of those cultivation activities and putting them into into a process that works for your organization. All right, so best practice number 10.
Caroline, do you have an example of the gift acceptance policy?
I do, and I will send it in the follow-up materials for sure.
Okay, thank you.
All right, final best practice number 10. Thank your donors always and often, I like to say. Again, timely fashion, 7 days or less if you can. Thank them regardless of size. IRS requires that any single gift of $250 or more must receive a tax receipt. But I would argue that a $5 gift deserves a letter of thanks. And quite honestly, to a point down here, do a thankathon. I'm going to jump over the impact of the gift for a second and talk about thankathons because I think they're wonderful. I hate phonathons, but I love thankathons. And a thankathon, if you're not familiar with this concept, is where you get board members, staff members, volunteers to actually just call and thank a donor for their recent gift. And certainly, your larger donors, that's appreciated, but, I would argue that you honestly see greater impact when you call and personally thank somebody who made a $10 donation to your organization. If a board member calls and just says, thanks, I really want to let you know that we appreciate your gift and, we're looking forward to, monitoring the river here this month, and we're really thankful to have your support so that our volunteers can get out there and, hey, would you like to come out and volunteer? Next time that person is asked for a gift, they're probably going to double their gift maybe, or make an even larger gift. So I think thankathons are a great way to especially engage boards and do some of that donor cultivation. When you're thanking donors, really important to talk with them about the impact their gift has made. So, I hope you're not just sending out a letter saying, thanks so much for your $25 gift to our organization. How has their gift made a difference? Because they're looking for that impact. And I do think it's important to recognize donors publicly. And here, whether it's through your annual report, now obviously some donors choose to remain anonymous, but whether it's through your annual report, on your website, I think there's a lot of value in recognizing people who support your organization. And again, getting to that peer pressure, if you include giving levels in your annual report, you may have some people actually increase their giving levels because they want to keep up with their friends and they see that their friends are giving at a higher level. So that's what I have about thanks. And just based on time here, Paco, let me go ahead and finish end of year so I can make sure we get through that content, those last couple of slides, and then we'll finish up any time we have left with questions, okay?
Sure.
So, last couple of slides here. This is your bonus content, right? This is your overtime. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about end of the year fundraising. Here we are halfway through December. And typically, most organizations use the last, 2 or 3 months of the year to develop their end of year campaigns. Many groups use Giving Tuesday as kind of their launch for their end of year campaigns. But the good news that I'm going to share with you today is that it's not too late. If you haven't given this much thought, I would encourage you, this is the one takeaway you can leave here with today. I've got some tips for you. It's not too late. You've got a couple weeks left. And thanks to what I like to call the generous procrastinators, there's still a lot of dollars out there, money on the table to be had. So, here are some basic statistics that should encourage you to get out there and make sure you're taking advantage of end of the year giving. I think one of the most important statistics here is that the biggest giving day of the year is December 31st. It is not Giving Tuesday yet. And that 12% of giving comes in the last 3 days of the year. The 2/3 of people who've donated do no research before giving really is saying that people are giving to organizations they already know. So, when we talk about tips, you should be reaching out to people who are already supporters of your organization that maybe you haven't heard from yet this year. Focus on your volunteers because research shows that they're twice as likely to donate as non-volunteers for your organization. And as I said, direct mail is not dead. So, most organizations still send out a direct mail appeal, but I would encourage you, as I show on this next slide, send an email on New Year's Eve. Use whatever means you have at your disposal to take advantage of end of the year giving. So let's talk about some tips. Again, you need to be realistic about what you can and can't do in the next 2 weeks. If you haven't done this, here is where I would focus your energies. Your lay bunts. This means these are donors who gave last year, but unfortunately not this year. Organizations, this is a fundraising term that's pretty commonly used, a lay bunt. And you also have some bunts, which are people who gave some year, but unfortunately not this year. Focus on your lay bunts. Anybody who made a gift to your organization last year, but you haven't heard from this year, again, if you've got a donor database, this is pretty easy information to pull out. Those are the people you should be targeting and appealing because they're already your supporters. Maybe they've just forgotten or thought they already made a donation this year. Focus on them. Again, we already talked about how important it is to focus on volunteers because they're twice as likely to give. But major donors, I do get this question a lot. Should my major donor get an end of the year appeal? And my answer is yes, but make it personal. And what that means is, say you can take your annual appeal letter, but do something different for your major donors. You don't want them to think that they're not valued this time of year. It's a great opportunity to actually stop and thank your major donors and your funders. All the foundations that support you, or even government organizations, government departments. Send them inspirational holiday greeting and talk about the successes this year. And that includes your major donors, whether or not they've made a gift this year or if you're still working toward that big ask. Some final tips. Change out your website if you can, so that when folks go to your website, they automatically are taken to the donation page, or if you have the ability, have a pop-up so that when they click on your website, it actually goes to your donation page. I would encourage you year-round to check your website. You know, it should take no more than 2 clicks for a donor to get to your donation page. Click on the website, click the Donate Now button. If they have to spend more time clicking through your website trying to find out how to make an online gift, you know, you run the risk of losing them. And as I said, you know, the biggest giving day of the year is December 31st. So send out an email on New Year's Eve and then make sure you have staff coverage. You know, whether it's you know, somebody doesn't have to literally be sitting in your office, but, you know, have a message that says, you know, thanks so much for calling us over the holidays. You know, if you have some questions or interested in making a last-minute gift, call such and such on this number, and we'll be glad to answer any questions you have. Make sure somebody's going to the post office, and you know, again, checking messages, because a lot of stock gifts come in on this day, and the poor people that are managing stock transactions need to know your DTC number, and you would hate to lose those gifts just because you didn't have coverage. So real important to try to take advantage of that. With that, as I said, we have a couple of things here before you go. Wanted to remind you about our next webinar in January on volunteer recruitment and management and retention. And also wanted to mention that we would really appreciate your feedback on our webinar evaluation survey. So Paca is going to pop that into the chat box for me here, but you will also get an email with a link to take that survey. And so we would really appreciate hearing from you and hearing you know, what worked well for you in today's webinar, what you would have liked more of or less of. And so with that, I show about 9 minutes left to try to get through some of these great questions that I see are popping up. So Paca, what have we got?
There was one that I answered, but maybe you want to compliment. It says, regarding thankathons, many people do not answer their phones if they do not recognize the phone number. Is it permissible to leave a voice mail in lieu of a one-on-one conversation to thank? And I said, yes, leave a message, but make a note of trying to call him back a little later, or at least in the message, leave a number that they can contact you. People really appreciate their donations being acknowledged.
Yeah, actually, that's kind of the best. That's the best case scenario. You know, board members are relieved when they get the answering machine, because then they just get to say thank you and they, you know, don't feel put on the spot. But I love the idea of leaving your number. You know, so hey, sorry I missed you, but I just wanted to call and say thank you so much. You know, we had 10 volunteers out doing stream monitoring this week, and we really appreciate everything you've done to help us with this program. We'd love to get you out on the river sometime. You know, if you have any questions, just give me a call back. But yeah, just that's kind of the best case scenario is you call them and actually they don't answer and you get the message, and then you know kind of get a reprieve. But no, it's awesome to talk with people, and I shouldn't say that because it's that connection with people when board members get off the phone and somebody's like, oh, they just wanted to call and say thanks. You know, because some people, I do it all the time. I answer the phone and I'm ready for some spiel, and somebody just wants to call and say thanks. It's like totally changes my day. I'm like, oh, that was awesome. You know, I feel so appreciated. So yeah, thankathons are great, but definitely leave a message. Don't miss that opportunity. Leave a message.
Thank you. And then there's one more that says, what percentage of giving comes from springtime fundraising events?
Obviously, it varies by organization and what type of appeals you're doing in the springtime. I like to encourage groups, and I don't know if I said this. I don't think I remember saying it, but I really encourage groups to make sure that you spread out your fundraising activities, at least have one per quarter. And so when you look at donations, then you can see how effective, your first quarter fundraising letter was by, just purely looking at your donations that you received in that period. So it's obviously very specific to your particular organization, but if you think about, looking at fundraising on a quarterly basis, that's one way to do it, and then just gauging how much comes in for your particular organization. Again, the statistics show that the majority of donations are received in the last quarter of the year, but your organization may do something unique at another time of year that you're really able to capitalize on. So.
Okay. Just so you know, Nicole Vance, she wanted a little more explanation later on the new tax laws and how it affects membership. So I asked her if she can reach out to you separately so that you could find out more resources.
Yeah, the great thing about this GoToWebinar environment is that all these questions will actually be recorded. So I am able to follow up with somebody if your question doesn't get answered here today. I'd be happy, and we'll follow up to make sure that we get all these questions answered.
And thank you all. I did repost the link because when I first posted it, it had little caret signs that didn't help. So you can just click on the hyperlink or copy and paste it. And definitely, just 4 minutes of your time will help us continue improving this webinar. Which a couple of comments in there, Caroline, it was well paced. It was very helpful, and looking forward to more resources.
Great. Yep. So you will get an email. If I've set it up correctly, you're actually going to get an email from GoToWebinar with the survey link and the link to today's recording. But probably early next week, I don't know that I will have an opportunity to do it tomorrow, but early next week, you'll get a MailChimp email from me with all of these additional resources that we talked about today. But again, would really encourage folks, if there is a particular area that you're interested in, like major gift asks and how to make the ask, send me an email and I can share with you the resources, both webinars and print resources that we have available. So please, reach out to either Paco or myself, and we'll be happy to give you as many resources as we can that we've worked with our organizations.
Yes, and this will include the Making the Ask webinar that a few folks have shown interest.
Yeah, for sure. Well, great. Are we good with questions? Any outstanding questions here?
Not that I see right now.
Okay, great. Well, awesome. Did one just pop up?
No.
See, we've got still, okay, can we make information? Yep, making the Ask webinar. Yep, I could do that. Okay. Well, it looks like I'm going to give everybody 3 minutes back of their day today. So I thank you for hanging on here to the end. Again, I know this is a big data dump, a lot of information, but hopefully, whether you're a seasoned fundraising professional looking for just some affirmation and a few great tips, or new on your fundraising journey, hopefully you're walking away with some, definite action items that are going to help you, whether it's year-end fundraising or planning for next year. So enjoyed being with you all today, and thank you so much for joining us here at River Network and our webinar. We hope to see you in January.
Thank you. Happy holidays to everybody. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Bye.
Bye.